Hello, everyone. Here we are again at our fourth event for 2022 seminar series, Dialogues on Ethology and Behavioral Ecology. And today is my pleasure to have here with us Professor Sergio Pellis from the University of Lethbridge in Canada. I will not introduce Sergio because I will leave this to Elisabetta Palagi, Professor Elisabetta Palagi, who was pivotal in having Sergio here with us. She was the one inviting him. So, Elisabetta, I give you the stage to properly introduce Sergio. And thanks, Sergio, for accepting this invitation.
Thank you, Alessandro. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Pellis. Just few words to introduce Sergio, the person and the scientist. Sergio was the first person to read my PhD thesis, and I was impressed by the fact that such an important scientist dedicated a large amount of time reading a thesis of a completely stranger student. But he did it. After receiving his comments, I was also impressed by his humility, which is a prerogative of the great persons. I want to share with you some few lines from his letter. So, Sergio wrote me just very few lines. The theoretical framework you develop is good. Again, you appear to recognize that different facets of play may be explained by different mechanisms. For example, you show that some features of play are likely a result of the Newtonian nature of the bonobos, whereas others do not. Similarly, at least for the detailed features of the organization of play, current function seems to be more important than common ancestry, that is phylogeny. At a broader level, phylogeny may be paramount, such as if the comparisons made here were extended to other apes and to monkeys. Again, what is fascinating is that all these factors are involved, and the trick is to unravel which are more important for particular traits. Your works provide an excellent model for such analysis. In the end, having read your thesis has caused me to reconsider my own work on play. So now let's go to the scientist. Sergio Pellis received his PhD in animal behavior and ethology in 1980 from Monash University in Australia. He spent 8 years at the University of Illinois, Tel Aviv University, and University of Florida, where he received postdoctoral training in behavioral neuroscience and movement analysis. In 1999, he joined the University of Lethbridge, Canada, where he is a full professor of animal behavior and neuroscience. A central focus of his research is on evolution, development, and neurobiology of play behavior. He published more than 200 papers on the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals. So, I am really enthusiastic to have Sergio here and also very happy to give him the floor. Thank you so much to be with us.
Thank you very much, Beta, and I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to delivering the presentation and then having chats with you and your students. Okay, so put this up. How are we going to do this? No. You all have to bear with me because this is new technology for me. Okay, so I can. So hopefully everybody can see this. So the main topic I'm going to deal with today is a particular kind of play that has been the main focus of my attention throughout my career, and that is play fighting. Essentially, play fighting is reflected in these two young boys engaging in rough and tumble play one tries to grab the other one, pin him to the ground, and so on. And this kind of rough and tumble play or play fighting is quite common amongst many species of mammals in particular. And
Sergio, sorry, can you use the slideshow modality presentation?
hang on, what am I missing?
Yeah.
Can you see the change in?
No.
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 Okay. Why is this not shared?
Okay, first technical problem.
So it was working earlier.
Can be solved.
Yeah, it was worked until a few moments ago, just so you know, guys, whoever is. Worst case scenario, Sergio, we move on this way.
Yeah.
Did you try to press the low button of presentation in the PowerPoint screen, bottom right? Yeah.
Yep.
But it doesn't work, right?
Nothing's working.
Oh.
Can't believe this. We did meet before this started and got it working. So so maybe Emiliano, you might have to move the slides for me from your end.
Okay.
No, go on this way, don't worry, but the animation will not appear in this way.
Right. But can you see this at all?
Yes, we can see the screen as if you were not going full screen. You know what I mean?
So if I go full screen, you can't see it anymore.
No, we can see it, but not in full screen. It's like you probably are in full screen in a second screen on your Mac.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I know because I have a Mac myself, and I know that they do it usually. So.
Okay, so what do you recommend?
Go on this way. Give your talk.
By selecting the slide on the left side.
And Emiliano will take care of the videos.
Yes.
Okay. So should I go full screen or not?
It is not working. So
No.
give it a try. Give it another try. But
yeah, no, it's not working at all. So you can't see that as a full screen?
No, we see it as a normal, PowerPoint presentation when you actually prepare the slides, right? Don't know.
Okay. Okay, so you can see this now?
I can see that, though, yeah.
And can you see my arrow?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So try to select the second slide simply by going with the mouse on the second slide on the left.
Can you see that?
So I think we can go on this way.
Okay, so this is actually a wonderful demonstration of what I'm hopefully going to convince you of today, that this kind of behavior helps develop adaptability and resiliency. So when you're confronted with unexpected events, you're more likely to be able to adapt to them. That's my rationale for my technical incompetence here. Okay, so a fundamental question that's been in the field for well over 100 plus years has been, well, young mammals like these engaging in this kind of play fighting or rough and tumble play, what do they gain from it? What's the benefit that may arise from doing this kind of behavior? And the animal that I found to be most useful to be able to explore that issue is this animal here. Let me see if these are rats. Can you see the rats moving?
Absolutely, it's very nice.
Very nice. Good. Okay, so you see these rats engaging in rough and tumble play or play fighting. They repeat sequences over and over, and the rats really enjoy this. It's it's not boring to look at them do this for long hours at a time. And so a lot of my students actually enjoy the process of scoring what these rats are doing. But just to give you a quick overview of what happens in this kind of play fighting in rats, here you have two juvenile rats. This is one rat approaching the other one from behind. It reaches up towards the back of the neck, the nape area, and just before it's about to touch the nape, the other animal turns to block access to the nape. This one continues trying to move around to the nape area, knocking this one over onto his side. As you can see, continues reaching around. The other one ends up lying on its back, protecting the nape from this one's snout. And then this one on the bottom lunges up towards the nape, and the one on top now is using his hind foot to block the snout of this one, knocking into the ground. The one on the bottom, as you can see in this slide, is now using his hind feet and gradually pushing the one on top off, pushes him off, gets up, and now the one that was on the bottom is now lunging and attacking the nape of the neck of the other one. So you can see this is a mirror image of this. They've just reversed roles. Now, it would take a whole other seminar to try to explain why contacting the nape of the neck is important to these animals, but the whole competition is about contacting the nape, rubbing it with the snout, and then you've won. And so the other one tries to stop you from doing that, and will do it back to you. Now, this behavior is very common in the juvenile period. It begins in late infancy, peaks in the juvenile period, and then gradually wanes to a lower level in adulthood, but doesn't disappear. And that's important because I'll use the fact that this kind of play fighting still occurs in adults later on in the presentation. But it occurs most frequently in the juvenile period, and there's been lots of experiments to look at, well, what happens when there is lack of juvenile play lack of play in the juvenile period. And typically in the past, and these sorts of experiments were begun in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and the typical way to do it was to have, after the rats are weaned from their mother, is to put them in individual cages like this, so they're isolated, and look at the effect of this isolation rearing on subsequent behavior and brain development in the rats once they reach sexual maturity, and compare these animals with animals reared in this kind of condition, where you can see there are multiple rats living together, they're in a bigger cage, there's more space to do things in, and so on. And when you compare these rats with these rats in adulthood, and you test them for various capabilities, what you get is that you get impoverishment in a number of things. So cognitive skills aren't as good. Their emotional regulation is impaired. Their short-term memory is not as good. They have impulse control problems. And most critically, for what I want to talk to you today, is that their social skills are diminished. Now, when we look at all these sets of skills, they are all related to a particular category of skills called executive functions. And so what appears to be the case is that lack of play experience in the juvenile period leads to impoverished executive functions. But before we can make that definitive, we do have a problem in that when you isolate rats in the kind of complete isolation I showed you, they're missing a lot of experiences, not just social play with peers. So you can't be sure that it's actually the play or the lack of play that's causing these deficits later in life. And so over from about the 80s onwards, people developed different ways of trying to dissect out the influence of the play experiences from other experiences that are abolished during complete isolation. So in one case, as shown here, you have two rats living side by side, separated by a barrier that's transparent, and it's got holes so they can see and smell one another and hear one another. They can even come close and sleep next to one another, but they can't physically touch one another. So they can't engage in play. And these animals, when you look at the various kinds of skills that I just mentioned, they show at least some of the same deficits as completely isolated rats. So that suggests that it's not just the absence of having another rat present, but it's something you're doing with them that's important. And hopefully that something I'll show you is play. Another paradigm that we developed in my laboratory was, well, from observations in the natural litters, what happens is as the young animals begin to play, they will preferentially play with one another, and the mothers will tend not to play with them. So the mothers will avoid the kids, they'll groom them and feed them and all those sorts of things, but the adult female typically doesn't play with the juvenile. So what we thought was, okay, well, if we rear a young juvenile post-weaning animal with an adult female, then there should be minimized play here, and then we should be able to, but they're getting all the other experience like huddling together, grooming together, walking around the cage together, etc. So it should be the case, if there's something deficient in this animal, it should be because of the lack of play experience with the adult. And indeed, in several ways, we've demonstrated that that does occur. Again, now making the contact more intimate than here, but still deficient in the play, and we're still getting these executive function deficiencies. But other researchers have shown that adults, because they are antagonistic to juveniles, this could be a stressful way to manipulate the play of this animal. So based on work done by Dorothy Einan, we, Schneider and ourselves, developed this model where, okay, let's put a rat that's a juvenile with another juvenile, but that other juvenile could be rendered play deficient, and Einan did that by injecting this animal with a drug that would still leave it moving around and exploring the cage normally, but non-responsive to the playful initiations of the other rat. An even better model was developed by Miriam Schneider, where she used this approach, but now had a high-playing strain of rat. In this case, the rats we use, Long Evans. She used Wistar rats and paired them with a low-playing strain, a partner from a low-playing strain of rat, the Fisher 344. And what she found was, yep, when this animal grows up, it shows deficiencies in executive functions. And we used this model ourselves and recently showed that indeed for Long Evans rats, which are the same ones we used in these models, are also showing executive function deficiencies. So, for example, in the experiment conducted by one of my PhD students, Rachel Stark, what she found was, if we compare rear a Long Evans rat with a Fisher 344 rat, and then the control condition is a Long Evans rat reared with a Long Evans rat, and then remember I said rats continue to play into adulthood, and in adulthood, play is used within a colony to reinforce and test each other's relationships. And when rats meet one another as who are unfamiliar to one another, in a neutral arena, what they'll do is they'll engage in play and then use the play to assess who that other animal is, who's likely to be dominant in that situation. And so these are just two simple measures of play. And what you can see is that the control rats, which are the Long Evans rats reared with Long Evans, and the experimental rats, which are the Long Evans reared with a Fisher 344 rat, when you put them in with a stranger, another Long Evans as in adulthood, they play just as much, and this is just two different measures of play. You see there's no difference between the groups. But what is different, and this is one of the problems with, and the stranger test is rather nice, is that the play tends to be a little bit rougher than the play that occurs within a colony. So the animals are more likely to make a mistake. So if you've got deficiencies in your social skills, you're more likely to do something wrong in this situation, in this stranger test, that leads to escalating the encounter from play to aggression. And this shows at a group level, this is just measuring the number of aggressive behaviors in total, so that could be threatening behavior, etc. Or this dark part of bites. What you can see is that Long Evans rats reared with Long Evans rats, so these are the control groups, when they meet a stranger, you get a little bit of aggressive behavior, but it's much greater in the Long Evans rats that have been reared with a Fisher rat, and you can see the total level of aggression is much higher, and you get quite a few of the encounters leading to bites. And in rats, I told you that in play fighting, you nuzzle the back of the neck, whereas in serious fighting, when you bite the lower flanks and a lower dorsum, the rump. This panel here looks at, well, which animal is doing the aggression. And what you can see is that in the experimental animals, the vast majority of this aggression is actually arises from the behavior of the Long Evans rat that was reared with a Fisher rat. So it's the one that's had the impoverished play experience. So now, putting all this evidence together, and I'm just giving you a slight flavor of the evidence, and it's just not in my lab, there's multiple labs now have shown this in these different paradigms. It really does look like reduced social play experience in the juvenile period leads to impoverished executive functions, and impoverished executive functions means that you're less competent in dealing with social situations and solving social problems. So the question, once we got to understand this, the question that, because I am in a neuroscience department and I had a colleague who is an expert on the neural mechanisms underlying executive functions. So in collaboration with him, Brian Kolb, what we asked is, well, what are the mechanisms the neural mechanisms that underlie these changes in executive functions? And since executive functions are primarily regulated by neural circuits in the prefrontal cortex, which is, excuse me, we hypothesized that changes in play experience should alter the development of the prefrontal cortex. And where is the prefrontal cortex in the rat? Here's a rat brain. Here's the front end. So this is right in front of your skull. I'm going to put it this way so you can see my face here. So this is right here, is this part here. This is the cerebellum, which in us is right at the back here. And this is where the base of the brain connects to the spinal cord. So it's this area right in the front here that's the prefrontal cortex. And this is the area we predicted should show changes if play is actually influencing the development of executive functions, we should see these reflected in changes in the development of the prefrontal cortex. Now, excuse me, got to wet my whistle. Now, based on clinical and experimental studies, so clinical studies on humans, experimental studies on cats, monkeys, rats, etc., there were two areas of the prefrontal cortex that are most likely to be important in these changes that are brought about by play experience. And that are these two areas. So this section shows, remember, let's go back to here, the brain here, you can imagine as two symmetrical halves. So this we're seeing at the left-hand side here, but there's, on the right-hand side, there's exactly the same part. So if we cut like this and look at it front on, what we would see is two hemispheres, two parts. So what I'm showing you here is one half, so one hemisphere. And the two areas that we focused on is this area here, called the medial prefrontal cortex, and this area here, called the orbital frontal cortex. And again, I deferred to my colleague Brian Kolb, who's an expert on this area of the brain, to review the literature, say, yeah, if we're going to look somewhere, this is where we should see effects. Okay, so the experimental design we came up with was we reared a juvenile with an adult, where we would expect this animal to experience little play. We reared two juveniles together, and we should get a reasonable amount of play. But we also know from other experiments we've done and other people have done that if you have multiple animals together, you get a contagion effect. So you get even more play. So if two rats play a lot, put four rats together and you get a mega amount of play. Okay. So we expected that if play experience is an important driver of changes in executive functions, and these are reflected in the prefrontal cortex, then we should see a change from here to here and a change from here to here. Now, this is important because often what seems to be logical leads you to new discoveries that you didn't expect to make. So what did we measure? And I say we, two of my PhD students, Heather Bell and Brett Himmler, spent endless hours on a microscope measuring the neurons in these parts of the brain. And this is what a neuron in these parts of the brain look like. These are pyramidal neurons. Here's the cell body here. And then they have these projections called dendrites. And so you can measure the dendritic arbor, just how many branches there are, how long those branches are, etc. And then when you look more closely at these dendrites, you can see that you have these little spines sticking here. And think of the spines as places where two neurons can communicate with one another. So the more spines, the more dendrites, the more communication with other cells. Okay. Now, typically what happens is during development, independent of play, but just over development, what happens is areas of the brain, such as these cortical areas, you get a proliferation of the number of cells, the number of dendrites, and the number of spines. Then with experiences, you get pruning. So the number of cells diminish as some cells die, leaving fewer cells. The dendritic arbor gets reduced and the number of spines are reduced. That's typical. But for some areas of the brain, the opposite occurs. Experiences preserve the greater abundance of cells, the greater dendritic arbor. Now, to make sense of that, think of sometimes for some of the things you do, less communication leads you to more effective action. if you get bombarded by too much information, things can go wrong. But for some decisions you make, you need more information. So depending on what functions these different areas of the brain have, you either diminish their complexity to make them more efficient, or you maintain complexity to fulfill the functions that they have. Now, what we found was that the experience of sibling play, so playing with a peer, that had the effect of simplifying or pruning the neurons of the medial prefrontal cortex. But this is the part that was really unexpected. If you have multiple partners, as here, what happens is the neurons of the orbital frontal cortex remain more complex. So, okay, my brain's splitting apart now because it's getting complicated. But essentially what we have, I'll try to simplify it here, is that if you're raised with an adult partner, you don't change from baseline. So your medial prefrontal cortex neurons are too complicated, and your orbital frontal cortex neurons are not complicated enough. If you have a peer partner, that gives you a pruning of the medial prefrontal neurons. And if you have 3 peer partners, you get the same magnitude of pruning. So it looks like it doesn't matter if you have 1 peer that you're interacting with or 3 peers, the amount of change in the medial prefrontal cortex is the same. If you have a peer partner, the orbital frontal cortex remains unchanged. So that means that interacting with a peer and getting play doesn't change the orbital frontal cortex. But if you have 3 peers, then you end up having orbital frontal neurons which are more complicated. Now we have a confound here that you have both play and number of partners that are contributing to these effects. So this both Heather and Brett repeated these experiments, but this time instead of having 3 peers, had a juvenile reared with 3 adults. And what you see is that if you're with 1 adult partner, there's no change in the medial prefrontal neurons. If you have 3 adult partners, there's no change in the medial prefrontal cortex. But if you just have 1 peer, you get a change, you get pruning. For the orbital frontal cortex, if you have 1 partner, be it an adult or a peer, the orbital frontal cortex doesn't change. However, if you have 3 peers, then it changes. And so those 3 peers can be adults or can be peers. What this tells us is that for the medial prefrontal cortex, it is the experience of play that is critical in pruning this area of the prefrontal cortex. For the orbital frontal cortex, play is not critical. What's critical is the number of individuals you interact with. Okay. Now that becomes important when we think about, well, what do these things do? So yeah, I just said that. This is just I like this graphics. I'll just show you. So these are from the Long-Evans versus Long-Evans Fisher 344 pairings we did. This is from Rachel Stark's PhD thesis, and we had a new way of measuring neuron complexity. So you can see right at the center here, that's that purpley bit, that's the cell body. Then these greenish projections are the dendrites. And what these red lines show is, imagine connecting all the most extreme parts of the cell and linking it together, and you can see that you generate a particular surface area and a particular volume. Now, this is the experimental rat, the Long-Evans rat that was reared with a Fisher 344 rat that experienced impoverished play. Just by eyeballing it, again, you see the cell in here, the cell body, the dendrites. You can just see by eyeballing it, the size is greater. So confirming that it is play with a peer that is critical in pruning this cell to look like this. Okay. Okay. But what are the roles of these areas of the prefrontal cortex? Since we now see that different kinds of experiences are shaping them developmentally in different ways, what are their roles? So in a series of ablation studies, so you get rats that have been normally reared, and then you do surgery to ablate that area, in this case, the medial prefrontal cortex. What we found was the following. So when rats play, I showed you an example of earlier of a rat contacting the nape and the other rat defending itself, and they get into a wrestle. And there are two distinct ways in which they wrestle. So in this case, one rat lunges at the other rat's nape, and this rat simply swerves away, runs away, jumps away. So this is evasion. It's fairly simple. This rat just has to detect the approach of this one and then get out of the way. In these two kinds of interactions, you see that this animal contacts the nape, and then this animal rolls over onto its back to defend the nape from the attacker. In this case, same thing, attack the nape, but now this animal protects itself by only partially rotating onto its side, but still maintaining postural stability on its hind legs. And these two forms of defense require closer coupling of your movements with those of the partner. So evasion is a simpler way of defending yourself. This is a more complicated way. And when, again, this was Heather's work, when she looked at control rats with intact medial prefrontal cortex, what you see is that the most common form of defensive tactics used are the complex ones, those involving turning and facing the opponent. And the least frequent are the simple ones. In the ablated animals, the reverse happens. The complex ones become less frequent, and the animal's more likely to use simple ones. Now, from this, we can infer that what appears to happen is that in the absence of medial prefrontal cortex, the animal is less capable of coordinating its movements with those of the partner. Now, that's for the medial prefrontal cortex. What about the orbital frontal cortex? Well, here we're going to take advantage of something else. Again, remember I told you that rats continue to play into adulthood. And this kind of play here, this kind of defense evasion, is about 20% of what they do at all ages, from infancy through to adulthood. The majority of what they do is one of these facing defenses where you directly turn and try to block the other animal from getting access to your nape. But here's the interesting thing. In males, in both males and females, in the juvenile period, this is the most common form of facing defense that you have. You roll over onto your back. That continues to be true for adult females, but at puberty, males make a transition from mostly using this supine defense to mostly using this standing defense. But it gets even more interesting than that, because this is a transition all males have, but then it depends on who you're interacting with as an adult as to whether you use this more often or this more often. So in rat colonies, what happens is you have the adult males. One of the adult males will become the dominant alpha male in the group, and he'll dominate all the other males. And so you've got subordinates and dominants. So what you can do is you can look to see, well, what does a subordinate do in response to being attacked by another subordinate male or by a female versus being attacked by a dominant male? And this is what happens. So if you're a subordinate male and you're playing with a dominant male and the dominant male touches the nape of your neck, what you'll do is, most often, you'll turn to supine. If you're a subordinate male that's attacked by another subordinate male or by a female, most of the time, you'll do the standing defense. So subordinate males will change their behavior depending on the identity of the attacking animal. So we could capitalize on this difference and design the following experiment. We formed groups of colonies of 3 animals each, 2 males, 1 female, adult animals. Let them establish a relationship with one another. Then we tested them, and yes, one of the males became dominant, the other ones were subordinate, and sure enough, when the subordinate was attacked by the dominant male, it mostly flipped over onto its back. But when attacked by the female, it would mostly do a standing defense. And so establishing that, then what we could do is do a brain lesion of the orbital frontal cortex or a sham lesion for the control animals and see, well, do they still show this difference? So you can imagine if you're counting supines in these interactions, subordinate with dominant, you'd get a lot of supines. You count the number of supines with a subordinate interacting with a female, you get few supines. So if we subtract this number from this number and convert it to a percentage, we should have a high index of asymmetry because you're going to show more asymmetrical behavior depending on the status of the animal you're interacting with. And this is what we got. So pre-lesion, so remember you want to show that the animal is differentiating between the identity of the partners, you want a high percentage, which gives us an asymmetry measure. And you can see that before the lesion, both the animals that are going to be lesioned later and those that are going to receive the sham lesion show a high index between 70 and 80% asymmetry. Then you give the lesion, let them recover for a week, and then let them pair them up to let them play again. And what you can see is that, and by the way, the amount of play engaged in by the lesioned and non-lesioned animals was exactly the same. What was different was in the animals with an intact orbital frontal cortex, they still show a high asymmetry. See, it's around 70%. So they can still tell the difference. Oh yeah, you're a dominant male attacking me, you're a female, I'm going to treat you differently. I'm going to respond to you differently. The ones with the orbital frontal lesion, practically down to zero. You don't even need statistics to see that there's a huge effect on the rats with the orbital frontal lesion. So what we can conclude from this is that the orbital frontal cortex is involved in modulating your behavior based on the identity of the partner. Not the partner's actions, but the identity of the partner. For the medial prefrontal cortex, it's not the identity of the partner, but what the partner is doing. So you're responding to the actions of the partner. Here you're responding to the identity of the partner. Now, just to confirm that, because this is all play both in the juvenile and adult period, so it could be just plays weird. So we have a different paradigm to corroborate this, and that's this. So there's a robbing and dodging paradigm. So one rat will pick up a piece of food and start eating it. The other rat in the cage will come along, sneak up and try to steal that food. And the animal with the food will swerve away to protect the food. Okay? So we looked at this paradigm for both animals with medial prefrontal lesions and orbital frontal lesions. And what we found was that with medial prefrontal cortical damage, the robber's ability to effectively coordinate its dodge with the movement of the robber was reduced, so the robber was more often successful in stealing the food. Whereas with orbital frontal lesions, what the animal did was show the same response irrespective of the identity of the partner. And the identity of the partner is important in this case because different individuals have different styles of robbing. So you have to adjust. So if Ralph is coming to steal from you, you've got to move differently than if John's coming to steal from you. But with the orbital frontal gone, they show no differentiation. So from this, we can conclude the following. The play experience directly influences the development of the medial prefrontal cortex and the skills that are the executive functions that are associated with the medial prefrontal cortex. Play is not necessary for the development of the orbital frontal cortex, but it is indirectly relevant because, as I told you, in normal litters, once the rats become juveniles, the adults lose interest in them, including the mothers. And so the main source of diversity in your partner experiences comes from playing with other juveniles. So although play is not directly relevant for the development of the orbital frontal cortex, it's going to have an indirect effect by expanding your experience of the types of partners you're going to interact with. Okay. So that's about 30 years of my life explained in half an hour. Now here's the other half, which is, okay, so is just play fighting in general important, or are there specific experiences derived from play fighting that are critical to having these effects on particularly the medial prefrontal cortex? And the answer is, it's not just play fighting as a whole, but there are particular features about play fighting that seem to be of great value. The first is that for play fighting to remain play fighting, there has to be some degree of reciprocity. And that very first cartoon I showed you with the rats playing, and I went through the sequence, you saw that one animal attacked the other one, they go into a wrestle, and then at the end, there's a role reversal. The one that was attacked is now doing the attacking, okay? So there's got to be some degree of reciprocity. And in fact, where you get escalation to serious aggression, even in juveniles, is where one animal tries to dominate and always win. The other animal doesn't like that and may escalate to aggression. So there's got to be some degree of fairness. Now, as an example, I'll just give you one very brief example of how that fairness can be incorporated. Now, I told you that in serious fighting in rats, what they do is they bite each other on the lower flanks and rump. That's true of most other mouse and rat-like rodents, such as hamsters. In hamsters, during play fighting, they nibble each other's cheeks, but in serious fighting, they lunge and bite at the lower flanks and dorsum. One of the problems you have when you're engaged in serious fighting, because remember, unlike play fighting, you're not going to be fair. Think of yourself at a bar on a Saturday night. If somebody picks a fight with you, you don't want to be fair. You want to not get hurt, right? So here's an example of, here's a hamster that's attacking this hamster, and what it needs to do is get to here and deliver a bite somewhere here. The problem is that this hamster, the defending hamster, is reared up, and as this attacking hamster reaches around to the lower flank here, what the defender can do is lunge and bite at the side of the face of the attacker. So the attacker's got a problem. How do I bite here and avoid getting bitten on my face? In this particular example, what the attacking hamster does is, before it lunges to the flank, what it does is it reaches up, blocks the face of the defending hamster with the paw, and so prevents it from lunging down, and then it lunges and bites the flank. So a common rule for many animals is there are multiple rules. Again, I would need a whole other seminar to explain all the different kinds of play fighting rules. But for many animals, like rats and hamsters, what you see is in serious fighting, defense is coupled with attack. You just don't attack. You also have a defensive component to block the counterattack, the retaliation from the other animal. In play fighting, that's not true. Let's see if this works. So these are two corellas. They're a type of parrot from Australia. And what you're going to see is this animal, they grab each other's foot. He lunges down at this foot. See, he's left the side of his face completely exposed to counterattack. That is, in play fighting, at least in some animals, you don't couple defense with your attack. That increases the chance that the other animal can successfully counterattack. Now, back to... Okay, stop, guys. So back to rats. One of the things we've seen is that in rats, remember that one animal being on its back and the other animal being on top is very common. So this is the typical pattern. This animal's lying on its back, protecting its nape from this one. And this one's problem is to try to hold this one in place and reach around and get at the nape and prevent this one from doing counterattacks towards the nape. To do that, it keeps its hind feet firmly on the ground, so it provides a stable base of support, so it can use its forepaws and upper body to counter the moves of this animal. But sometimes the rat on top does something which is counterproductive. It stands on the bottom rat with all forepaws. I learnt about postural stability when I first moved to North America and experienced my first winter where I had to walk on ice. If you don't have a stable base of support, it's very difficult to remain upright. And indeed, when we compare the number of successful counterattacks by this animal towards this animal's nape, typically in this posture, it's about 30%. When the animal on top is standing on this one on all fours, the success rate of counterattacks goes up to 70-80%, which means that this animal is self-handicapping itself, making it harder to control the situation, making it easier for the other animal to counterattack and have a role reversal. Okay, so from this we can conclude that, yep, play fighting involves competition, but somehow, and different species do this in different ways, they moderate that competition with some cooperation. But again, this is where executive function skills come in, because even if you're following the rules, sometimes one of the partners may be doing something where you can't be sure. Is he following the rules or did he just cheat on me? And here I'm going to show you an example of cheating, because this problem creates ambiguity. Here's, they're all working. So just watch this in normal speed. These are two kids playing at the front here. One kid comes from the back and kicks this one on the head, knocks him to the ground. So there's an ambiguous situation here. He was playing with him. He took advantage of his inattention to deliver a blow sufficient to knock him to the ground. He has to decide, is this guy cheating or was that meant to be playful? He doesn't know. So I'm going to show you this in slow motion, and we'll look carefully at the behavior of this interactant. Okay. So slow motion, focus on the kid in the blue sweater. He's coming around. When you see him around here, look at his expression on his face. It's a pretty neutral expression. Jumps up, kicks. They both fall to the ground. Now watch the behavior of this child here. He stands up, faces this one. It's got a beautiful primate play face. He's telling him, hey, I was just playing. Don't take it seriously. Okay? Now this is critical because that means that during play fighting, you have to follow certain rules, but there's some ambiguity because sometimes you can't be sure whether the rules were engaged in or not. And so you end up having to negotiate transgressions and make decisions about them. And a very important component of that is communication. And if I'm sure Betta's explained to you a lot about communication in play because she's been one of the leaders in identifying how communication can influence the capacity to maintain and sustain prolonged play fights, because you've got these little ambiguous moments and the communication can be a way of smoothing them over. But it means that you have to know how to follow rules and you have to know how to make judgments about when maybe the rules weren't followed. And these experiences essentially require using things like impulse control. Just have a look at the situation before I respond, right? Emotional regulation. If that was a playful kick, I'm going to have a very different emotional experience here than if it was a serious kick. Short-term memory. I've got to remember, how many times did I win in the play fight? So do I need to self-handicap to allow my partner to have a chance at winning? I have to pay attention to what's going on. I can't be oblivious. I have to look at the nuances. I have to look at things like what the facial expressions are in primates like these humans, or in rats, mostly vocal sounds such as ultrasonic calls. And then I have to make decisions. Essentially, all these things are the components of executive function skills. So play fighting then is a critical part of allowing you to experience the kinds of things that force you to use executive function skills and so develop them more sharply during the juvenile period when you're play fighting. But there's just one more thing that we need to look at is it really this fairness, reciprocity, ambiguity that's really critical, or is it just the total amount of play? And for this, exceptions that prove the rule. Now, for the Italian speakers amongst you who are more closely associated with Latin, you know that this expression is not that the exception proves the rule, but this is provare. Exceptions test the rule, okay? And so here are a couple of tests of the rule. So when we looked at, one of the criticisms we got was from our work on the development of the medial prefrontal cortex, the role of play is, well, but all your rats are laboratory domesticated rats. So this could be just an artifact of domestication. So in conjunction with a group in Warsaw, Poland, we replicated all these studies using wild rats. So now we eliminate the effects of domestication. And we found something very interesting. Again, an exception that tests the rule. So we did the play condition, two peers reared together, the no play condition, a peer, a juvenile plus an adult. And these are two different measures of complexity of the dendrites of the medial prefrontal cortex. We got absolutely no difference. So one possibility is this is an artifact of domestication, because if we look up here, here's a Long Evans rat that's been reared either with an adult or with a peer, and you can see that there's actually a considerable change in this measure of dendritic arborization and here. So we're definitely getting an effect in the domesticated strain. We're not getting this in the wild strain. So either this is due to domestication, or domestication has done something else, not impair the function of play. When we compare the play, actually look at the play of a juvenile interacting with an adult, either in this Long Evans domesticated strain or in the wild rats, what you can see is, look at the number of nape attacks. How many times do you attack the nape? And you can see that the juvenile is attacking the adult nearly 88 times per 10 minutes. And the percentage of attacks performed by the adult is below 8%. In the wild rats, one of the effects of domestication is that it makes animals more playful. And sure enough, you can see that the wild rat is initiating about half as many playful attacks. But this is the critical thing. Look at the contribution of the adult. Nearly 26% of the attacks are by the adult. Compare that to under 8% by the domesticated adult. But the really critical thing is, if we look at role reversals and consider a role reversal as a successful counterattack, remember I showed you that they try to counterattack one another? A successful counterattack leads to a role reversal because the other animal then adopts a defensive posture. The first thing to notice is that in the domesticated animals, again, these are a juvenile with an adult, there's a significant reduction in the number of role reversals in a 10-minute period. And this is a significant difference here. But the really critical thing is, look at this. It's just around 6% of the role reversals are performed by the juvenile. 31% of the role reversals in the wild pair is by the juvenile. So the juvenile is experiencing both receiving more attacks and having to deal with them, and also in deciding when to self-handicap to create the role reversals, okay? So it's not just the total amount of play that's important, it's the reciprocity experiences that you're gaining through play. Okay. And it turns out it's not just the amount of reciprocity either, right? Because that could just be, well, it's the total amount that's important. No, more recently, again, with the work of my recent PhD student, Rachel Stark, what she looked at was pairs of Long Evans rats and Long Evans Fisher 344 rats playing together. And this is the proportion of counterattacks that are successful, right? So role reversals. And what you can see is that the experimental animals actually experience significantly more role reversals. So these animals are actually experiencing more role reversals. So the absolute number of role reversals is actually greater in here than here. From what I just told you, that doesn't make sense. Except that if we now look at this panel, where this looks at the asymmetry between the partners, as you can see, in these animals, so two Long Evans together, they're fairly symmetrical. So we're both having chances to engage in role reversals. In this case, there's a lot of asymmetry. So it's not just the number of role reversals, but it's your relationship with your partner. Can we maintain a relatively symmetrical relationship in our experiences in who gets to win, when, and how often? When do you need me to stop better? Because
we have just 10 minutes, more or less.
Okay, so I'm just going to tell you that the problem with the OFC is different. I'm going to skip all that because I want to get to the main lessons here, okay? And since you're an ethology group, what's going to be important to you is, oh yeah, you're telling me a lot about rats, but what about other animals? Okay, so I want to put what we've just seen in rats in a bit more of a comparative context and show you that there's room for many more play researchers for another several decades yet to really tie all this up together nicely. Okay, so what have we learnt? Well, first of all, play fighting is not just a simulation of serious fighting. We have ways of cooperating which moderate the competition involved, and those experiences are important for generating animals that are more resilient and better able to deal with things that are unexpectedly happen in the world. And my argument is that a better way to deal with this is by developing the executive functions mediated through the prefrontal cortex more effectively. Now, here's where the comparative thing is. So is this function true for all types of play and for all species that engage in play? Let me just show you a little example here. Here's a cladogram of, here's a rat, here's a mouse, house mouse, here's a two types of hamsters, here's voles, and all these animals have in common that they engage in play fighting built around non-aggressive targets. So rats for nape, hamsters for the cheeks, etc. Now, and you can see that there's variation in complexity. Now, where it's been tested, the effects of play-induced changes in executive functions have been shown to be true in rats, been shown to be true in Syrian hamsters, and the only other species on this cladogram that's been tested is the house mouse, and the answer is no. The house mouse has very impoverished social play, but it has a very rich locomotor play, but it doesn't have this effect on executive function. So this suggests that there's a long way to go. There's a lot of comparative work that needs to be done, but the answer seems to be no. There's certain types of play in certain species within lineages which have derived this benefit. And the final question I want to leave you with is, for those that show a comparable effect, i.e. play does seem to be important for improving executive functions, is it to the same degree in all species? Well, here's an example where it may not be. So these are both types of macaques. These are Japanese macaques and these are Tonkian macaques. They have the same basic social system, but in these animals, the hierarchy is more rigid. In these species, the hierarchy is more fluid. And their play looks similar, except that there's much more cooperation in the play of these species and much more competition in the play of these species. And one of the reflections of that is in this. Most play is dyadic, and so what we have in Japanese macaques, virtually all the play is dyadic. When a third member joins, it usually is, I'm playing with somebody, another animal comes in, that animal attacks me, I turn my attention to this one, and the other one goes away. So it's very brief and sporadic. However, in the Tonkian macaques, nearly half the play involves multiple animals, and indeed the largest one we saw was a group of 8 juveniles in a big mound, and everybody just grabbing some part of another animal, biting it and so on. So there's plenty of problems with ambiguity. So this would suggest that the Tonkian macaques may be getting more of those experiences to maybe develop executive function skills to a higher degree than Japanese macaques. But again, the problem is there's a lot of comparative work that needs to be done, but the answer is probably not. We're going to see variation. That's the end of my story. I just want to thank my students and collaborators for all the hard work that they've contributed to this story over the several decades it's taken. And certainly since I've been in Canada, a major source of funding for all this has come from NSERC. So thank you very much, and happy to entertain whatever questions I can in the time I've left you.
Thank you so much, Sergio. A lot of things to think about, and concept, important, very important concept. So now I would like to know if someone has question.
Yeah, for people that are on YouTube, oh, there is a question already.
Okay. So the first question is, what about the 50 kilohertz vocalization in socially isolated rats? Were they able to communicate their playful mood through acoustic signals? And if they did, they did properly decode others' vocalizations?
Yeah, so first of all, in rats, if you prevent them from exhibiting or being able to produce 50 kilohertz calls, then the amount of play and the amount of reciprocity is reduced by half. So they can still do it, but they're not as good, which again suggests that the communication helps facilitate the negotiation. A group in Germany has looked at, well, what happens if you isolate the rats during the juvenile period? How effective are they in adulthood? They didn't look at their play, but what they looked at was their ability to discriminate calls that they were hearing, and they were less able to discriminate calls. So that would suggest that the play experiences and using calls in the juvenile period are also probably helping sharpen your ability to interpret calls, what their meaning may be in relationship to what the other animal is doing, and insert your calls in a more effective way as well. But that's a whole new area that really needs to be studied in depth.
Okay. Let's see the next one. So the next one is, many primates and carnivores perform facial expression to manage playful session. And they are asking if you ever observed the presence of facial expression in rats while playing. And and I would add, okay, but do you think it could be an interesting topics, maybe to do some possible comparison across mammals, I mean?
Yeah, so here's a problem with rats. They're nocturnal. So the majority of their behavior is going to be conducted in the dark. So even though occasionally you do see some facial expressions, they're not likely to be important for regulating interaction simply because the other animals are not going to be able to see them. And so I think that's why things like the vocalizations are so important for rats, because they're in a medium where they're going to be more effective to communicate with. And also, we do have some indications now that it's the way you touch each other that's also an important clue as to what the intentions of the partner are. So that's an area we're exploring at the moment. But again, we're dealing with animals that have evolved to play in the dark, which means that touch and sound are probably more likely to be critical than visual signaling.
Okay.
I would have a question myself, if you don't mind, Elisabetta.
Okay.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah. You mentioned a few things that are very, very interesting for me. I work mostly on carnivores, okay, and I work mostly on species in the wild. So I just did very few studies in captivity, so I'm not familiar with those. So apologies for questions that are not very. But my point is, what are your expectations in those species in which there's not many twins or siblings to play with, or even in those that we know that they play, but they would play with the parents rather than with other siblings or with objects. And I'm thinking about some singletons and species where the sociality is not as developed as in rodents, because we know rodents are very, very well developed kind of sociality and I would say even cognitive capacities. So what is your expectations? And I work on canids, and usually they even those that they leave not in a big group after, they play a lot with each other when they are siblings in a big litter, but then they spread in the future. So as adults, they have a completely different kind of interactions later on. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. So, so the short answer is I have no idea, because simply aren't the studies there to really look at this. But here's my expectation, and Betta's done a bit of work with some carnivores as well, and looked at communication. My suspicion is the following. Let's just take an extreme example. If you're a tiger, you grow up, you've got siblings to play with, but then once you leave home, you're on your own. Okay? Yep. Compare that to a lion. You've got siblings, you play with your siblings, and probably comparable aged animals from other litters, right? And then you remain in a social setting for your whole life. So my expectation is the following, that the play is probably going to be very similar in both, except in the lions, my prediction would be that those reciprocity-driven experiences are probably going to be exaggerated, because the lions are going to need to have sharper social skills to deal with living in a more complex social environment as adults. I've always wanted to do that study. I'm now nearly 70. I've passed my prime. I will not do it, but I think that is just a perfect comparison to make, and I'm sure you could do the same with taking some canid species, which are very closely related, similar lifestyles, except for the sociality, and do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about coyotes, for example, and jackals.
Mm-hmm.
They show a completely different kind of sociality later on as groups. Jackals they live in groups, some species.
Yeah.
But would you expect to see any significant difference in the development of the brain in those areas that are affecting during the development?
If the play is influencing their development, then the answer is yes. And again, if you think back to the comparison between the Japanese macaques and the Tonkin macaques, right? If you look at those, and again, I've always wanted to do this, but I've run out of lifetime to do it, is if you would look at the medial prefrontal, the orbital frontal, the equivalent in primates, my guess is that you would get differences, and that play contributes to the development of those differences. So again, it would require a whole research program, and dealing with a little rat brain that's this big is complicated enough. Dealing with a brain that's a lot larger and more expensive to process.
Okay, I got it.
I've got a student doing his PhD on rats now, but he did his master's on looking at beluga whales, and he really got interested in there's that social variation as well. But then he quickly realized, he's not going to have a research career looking at brains of different cetaceans. There's just too expensive, too hard to get.
Okay. So Sergio, for the sake of time, because we have to move in the other room where we will have a more restricted discussion with the students, I want to thank you and thank Elisabetta for having invited you. So thanks a lot for your contribution. It was very, very interesting. And it opened a lot of interesting, creative questions in people like me that are not familiar with these topics. So I truly appreciated it, and we really enjoyed it. So thanks a lot, and thanks Victor for having engaged. Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, okay. And so for everyone, Emiliano, can you show the next? Thanks a lot, Ricardo. And so a lot of people are commenting and thanking Sergio for his contribution. And so I wanted to say goodbye to everyone and to remind you that on May 27th, Darren Croft, a professor from the University of Exeter in England, will be talking about another incredibly interesting topic, that is the evolution of menopause in toothed whales. I can tell you this is going to be very, very interesting and surprising. So I hope to see many of you in a couple of weeks from now, 3 weeks actually, and it will be, as usual, a nice seminar. Okay. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks again, Sergio and Elisabetta.
Okay. So we're going to meet up on